Now that we've covered the CIA triad, which includes the most important security concepts, in this lesson we'll cover some other terms that are also very important. Actually, there's many. Sensitivity, concealment, secrecy, privacy, isolation, seclusion, non-repudiation, that one's important, usability, accountability, accessibility, discretion, and finally, criticality. Let's start from sensitivity. Sensitivity refers to the quality of information which could cause harm or damage if disclosed. Maintaining confidentiality of sensitive information helps to prevent harm or damage. To better explain it, sensitivity is similar to classification. For example, a document aimed for a wider audience, for example, an advertisement, could be classified as public, but military intelligence information is likely to be classified secret or even top secret if needed. Now on to concealment. Concealment is the act of hiding or preventing disclosure. In practice, what does that mean? Well, it means you're hiding something. What does it mean in security? Let me give you an example. Let's say you work for a company that uses a web application firewall and other security systems as well, but let's use a web application firewall here for the sake of an example. So your company knows it's not the best firewall out there, or it may even be aware of the fact that there are some vulnerabilities in it. Concealment in this case would mean that your company bans its employees from disclosing the type of firewall it uses and potentially even the vendor of that firewall. The logic there being, if an attacker doesn't know what kind of defense systems we use, they can't attack us. This is, of course, wrong, and we'll talk about that later, because scanning an environment to find out what kind of infrastructure a target has is one of the first steps hackers will take, and it's also not that complex. Now, secrecy. It should be straightforward. It's all about keeping information secret. Depending on the kind of information an organization is dealing with, it will define the level. It, meaning the organization, will define for itself the level of protection needed for different classes of data. On the other hand, privacy usually refers to information that contains personal data or information that, if leaked, might cause harm. We'll talk later about some laws and regulations that aim to protect privacy. Isolation is a concept very much applicable in IT security. For example, an important security principle is to segregate networks, meaning you will ideally have a separate little network for each different service. And this is even more important in cloud, but that is out of scope for our topic here. Simply put, isolation is the act of keeping something separated from others. It can be used to prevent co-mingling of information or disclosure of information. Each organization needs to evaluate the nuances of confidentiality they wish to enforce. What this means is, I mentioned network segregation a moment ago. Well, long story short, doing that increases cost. So the more network segregation or any type of complicated settings really increases your costs. So organizations will certainly look into if that is absolutely necessary and if it is, at what length. Our next concept, seclusion, is very much related to isolation. The difference is an admittedly small nuance. Seclusion involves storing something in an out-of-the-way location. Unlike isolation, it focuses on one object, making sure it is quote unquote out of the way, as the definition says. Isolation, on the other hand, is more like an overall approach that applies to all, whatever it is we're talking about, either all data or all assets, while seclusion focuses on a singular object. Non-repudiation. It's actually a rather important one. It goes, non-repudiation ensures that the subject of an activity or who caused an event cannot deny that the event occurred. Let me give you an example here. Say there's an administrator, a system administrator, who steals some information from a server and then deletes any logs that might prove that the system admin did that. In order to ensure non-repudiation, you'd introduced what is called a segregation of duties, meaning if an administrator has such rights to make important changes on a given system, they cannot also have the same rights on the logging system. Often activity logs are collected in some central place, such as a data lake or a CM, and organizations will be better off if they make sure that the same people cannot access everything. In this case, both the systems they might either unintentionally or intentionally compromise, and also the system that logs their activities. This, of course, is just one example. It can also be achieved with digital signatures, which are included in the concepts mentioned on the slide: identification, authentication, authorization, accountability, and auditing. Next, we have usability, and this is a rather straightforward concept. In information security, we define usability as something, usually application, platform, framework, that is easy to use or learn how to use. The reason why we at all mention it here is because oftentimes security will be at odds with usability, meaning to increase security, you'll have to, annoy the users with some additional steps, authentication or other checks that will almost always decrease user experience. As an information security expert, you might be tasked with making a decision on such things. Are your security policies really worth the annoyance that users or customers will be subject to? In our previous example with the system admin who maliciously stole some documents off of a server and then tried to cover up, an accountability mechanism would help enable holding that individual accountable, and the consequences for violation of organization's policy are usually described in an employment contract. So, moral of the story, always carefully read your contracts. Just to clarify, I don't expect you to do something illegal and advise you to read the contract to learn how you might get sanctioned, but rather read it so you're familiar with your organization's rules and policies so that you're sure to follow them. Accessibility is very similar to availability with only a nuanced difference. Availability might mean that the web server is up, for example, a web server. So the web server is up, that means it's available, it's powered on, and the OS is running, but the web application has a bug. And for example, users can't perform a certain function. Next, we have discretion. Per definition, it is an act of decision where an operator can influence or control disclosure in order to minimize harm or damage. Another important term that also contains this word is discretionary access controls. And that is a system that allows the owner, or like a data custodian of an object, to control and define access to that object. All objects should have owners, and access control is based on the discretion or decision of the owner. Hopefully that makes sense. And finally, our last concept, criticality. It's best described as a level to which information is mission critical, meaning how important it is to an organization. Usually, the more important it is, the more need there is to keep it confidential. And that's it. By the way, the list goes on, but since this is a fundamentals course, even this list is quite comprehensive. The most important takeaway from this is that there's nuanced differences between these terms, and why understanding that is important is if you're ever faced with an audit, for example, and you claimed in your policy that you enforce some of these concepts, the auditors are going to ask you to prove it. So you want to avoid failing an audit just because you use the term you thought was a synonym when it turns out it's not. Anyway, that's it for this lesson. See you in the next one.